Everybody loves a good rivalry. I don't know about you, but nothing motivates me like some friendly competition. There are so many famous rivalries in both real life and literature. There's Goku and Vegeta, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, Tom and Jerry, and there's so many more. Since rivalry stories permeate all over the world, it makes sense that we'd find them in religion too. The most famous rivalry in religion is probably God versus Satan, but they're definitely not the only example. Egypt's famous rivalry is Horus and Set. Meanwhile, the Norse have Loki and Odin. For this video, we're turning our attention to ancient Greece, with one of their most famous rivalries being Orion and Scorpio. Orion and Scorpio might not be the first rivalry you think of when you think of ancient Greece. Some of you may be thinking, what about Poseidon and Athena? And that's a fair point. They do have a popular myth where they compete for the city of Athens. Take a wild guess who won that competition. But I say Scorpio and Orion are much more interesting because their rivalry is still happening in the sky every night. Orion and Scorpio's rivalry has achieved such longevity because their story originated from observing constellations, and because the constellations are still in our sky, the rivalry between Orion and Scorpio has outlasted the religion it was originally a part of. So today, we're exploring the origins of this rivalry, and not just their origins in Greece, but back to where the Zodiac originally got started, in ancient Babylon. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Ko-fi. You'll find the links below. Thank you. For those who don't know, despite names like Leo and Gemini, our zodiac does not originally come from ancient Greece. The Greeks got their zodiac from the Phoenicians. The Greeks just changed some of the names when they were introduced. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians got their zodiac from older Middle Eastern empires, like the Babylonians. There's some academics who theorize that there are even more ancient zodiacs, older than the Babylonian one. Some claim that cave paintings could be star charts, but there's not really enough evidence to back this up, and the scholarly consensus as of the release of this video is that Babylon is as far back as we can trace our Western zodiac without too much guesswork. One more bit of housekeeping before we begin. Orion technically isn't part of the zodiac, but because his story is so heavily intertwined with Scorpio's, I've decided it would be the easiest to knock both of them out with this one video. And now at last, we can finally begin the history of these constellations in one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, the ancient empire of Babylon. Now, despite how I started this video, you might be surprised to learn that Orion and Scorpio didn't start out as rivals in Babylon. And that's mainly because Scorpio, or as the Babylonians called him, the Scorpion, didn't have any stories associated with it. The Scorpion was just that, a constellation representing the animal. There weren't really any stories. And this isn't an odd thing for Babylon either. A general rule of thumb is that if a constellation is an animal, then it probably doesn't have a story, at least in Babylon. That changes when you get to other civilizations. Outside of the myth, however, there is an interesting fact about the history of Scorpio. Scorpio was bigger in ancient Greece. When Scorpio came to Greece, the Greeks merged it with another constellation from Babylon, the Scales, which you may know better as Libra. Because of this fusion, Scorpio was not only bigger, it also had more stars overall. The Scorpio we know was still the main body of the constellation, but Libra acted as the claws of the Scorpion. In fact, Libra didn't become an official part of the zodiac again until the Romans adopted it. That's everything Babylon can tell us about Scorpio, and now we can move on to Orion. In Babylon, the constellation of Orion was actually identified as several different gods, but many of whom all fell into a category of Sukal. Sukal is a Babylonian term, which basically means assistant to a god. One of the Sukals Orion was identified with, I've already spoken about in the past. I spoke about them in my Ishtar video, Ninshabar, the Sukal of Ishtar, or Inanna if we're talking about Babylon. I do want to remake my Ishtar video at some point, because that video summarized the Akkadian version of the myth, and as many people pointed out in the comments, the Babylonian one is more well known, and it's arguably the better version. No promises on when it's coming out, but I am currently researching it. Another famous Sukal Orion was identified with was Papsukal, the Sukal of Anu, the king of the Babylonian pantheon. As a Sukal, he was the advisor/secretary to Anu. He was sort of the middleman people had to get through in order to get to the guy in charge. He was also labeled as the shepherd of Anu and keeper of his throne. So basically, this was an ancient Mesopotamian bench warmer. Despite the fact that Papsukal was a sidekick to one of Babylon's head gods, there are more stories available about Ninja Bar instead of Popsicle, so there's not a lot to talk about aside from his job description. Since there's not a lot to talk about regarding Popsicle, and because I want to save Ninja Bar and their role as Inanna's Tsuko for a future video, that's all we're going to talk about for Orion and Babylon today. As you can see, despite being rivals in ancient Greece, Scorpio and Orion, or the Scorpion and Popsicle, don't have any relationships to each other, at least none that we know of. So why do they have a relationship in Greece? It's not entirely clear why these constellations became linked, but one possible reason is that when Scorpio rises above the horizon, Orion retreats below it on the other side of the sky. The Greeks may have noticed this and decided to come up with an explanation for it. And what was that explanation, you may be asking? Well, good for you, we're about to find out as we go to Greece. So, there are two major stories involving Orion, and this is one instance where the stories don't necessarily conflict with each other, at least not till the end. This time, we're starting off with Orion instead of Scorpio. Orion is a son of Poseidon and Eurale. Eurale could be multiple figures, ranging from a princess to one of Medusa's sisters. Thankfully, she doesn't appear in the story beyond his birth, so this is the last we'll hear of her. After Orion's birth, we fast forward straight into adulthood, with Orion trying to find a girlfriend. He's taken up hunting as a hobby, and he's pretty good at it, proudly boasting about his impressive skills. While on the hunt, Orion notices the princess of Chios, Merope, and he falls head over heels for her. He's so obsessed with her that instead of going up and introducing himself like a normal person, he goes straight to her father to ask her hand in marriage. Just an FYI for anyone in the dating sphere, read Greek mythology and then don't do any of it. The king of Chios tells Orion that he may have his daughter's hand in marriage if he can rid Chios of all savage beasts. Orion swore he would do it, like an anime protagonist swears by their goal at the beginning of the series, and he went off to hunt. Meanwhile, the king thought that Orion would get eaten alive by all the animals, so there'd be nothing to worry about. Unfortunately for him, after several months, Orion returned claiming that he had successfully killed all savage animals on Chios. The king heard that and he thought fast. Instead of moving the goalpost like other kings might do, he just straight up calls Orion a liar and tells him to get out. Orion was outraged by this and went back to his home to drink. And after a few drinks, Orion had a thought. In his drunken state, he made a plan. He was going to kidnap Merope. In one version, the story ends there. Orion chases Merope and some other women, and they become the Pleiades, a group of stars in the night sky that the Orion constellation follows through the season. But in other versions, the story continues. The myth doesn't say if Orion actually forced himself on Merope, but Merope claims Orion did this. And the king of Chios reacts in the worst way a parent can react. He says, "Great, now I have a legitimate reason to get rid of Orion." Yeah, he really said that right in front of his daughter's face. Like I said, read Greek mythology and don't do it. The king invites Orion to a feast, and while they eat, Orion gets wicked drunk again. Guys, I think Orion might have a drinking problem. While Orion is hammered, the king takes this opportunity to gouge Orion's eyes out, leaving him blind. Orion left the castle and wandered over the ocean. By the way, in case I didn't mention, because he's the son of Poseidon, he can walk on water. Eventually, despite being blind, mind you, Orion finds an oracle who says Orion needs to let the first sunlight touch his eyes. Only then will he regain his sight. Orion set off to the edge of the eastern sea. I don't know how he knew where he was going. I hope the oracle pointed him in the right direction. When he finally got to the edge, Orion let the rising sun touch his eyes and he regained his sight, only to experience tunnel vision as he marched straight back to Chios. Eos, goddess of the dawn, saw Orion and tried to stop him from pursuing his revenge quest, but Orion was determined. The king of Chios must have heard Orion was on his way, because when Orion arrived at Chios, he couldn't find the king or Merope anywhere. Orion sat alone on Chios, tired from his travels, and that's when he met Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. These two both shared the hobby of hunting. Well, technically for Artemis it was a divine domain, so it's more like a lifestyle, not a hobby. But because they had shared interests, they hit it off instantly and became fast friends. They spent a whole lot of time together, hunting and getting to know each other. Some of you people might know where this is going, but I want to say, leave your expectations at the door and come in with an open mind, because there's another way to view how this story continues. By the way, this is also where another divergence in the story happens. In one version of the story, Apollo gets worried that Artemis is getting too close with Orion, and that she may break her vow of virginity. To, and I add heavy air quotes on this, protect his sister, Apollo challenges Artemis to an archery contest. Each of them take pot shots at a target on the horizon, and whoever hits it wins. Apollo goes first, fires his arrow, and he misses. Artemis then steps up, she fires her arrow, and hits the target directly. Apollo cheers, and Artemis wonders, why is my brother cheering for me when I beat him? She then went to go see what she shot, only to realize the target was Orion, and she shot him in the head, ending his life. Artemis was outraged at Apollo for tricking her, but he explains he did this to protect her virginity. We don't know what Artemis's reaction to that specific comment is, but we do know she ends up making Orion a constellation in the sky to honor his memory. And now, the interesting thing is, because of this story specifically, Orion has been viewed as the one man Artemis loved, but when you read the story, there isn't really any indication of that. Apollo is worried about his sister losing her virginity, but there's no indication that Artemis and Orion had romantic feelings for each other. In fact, you could even say there's indication against this. We already know what Orion does when he likes a girl. He asks the father for her hand in marriage, and he never did that in this story. So while this story has been painted as tragic lost lovers, in reality, you could maybe more accurately view this as Artemis and Orion's friendship, which I think is really nice. We have millions of stories about people falling in love and romance, and don't get me wrong, romantic love is beautiful, but it's nice to see a story where two people of the opposite genders are just chilling and hanging out, being friends. I feel like sometimes society can forget that. By now, you may have noticed that there's a suspicious lack of Scorpio in this version of the story, and that's because Scorpio comes in where I mentioned the last divergence. In the other version of this story, before Apollo even gets involved, Artemis and Orion are hanging out together, and Orion brags about how great of a hunter he is. He even declares, in anime protagonist fashion, that he'll hunt every single creature on the planet. Artemis and Orion's great-grandmother, oh right, yeah, I forgot to mention, they're cousins, Gaia, goddess of nature, aka Mother Earth, heard Orion's boast and took that challenge by creating Scorpio to hunt Orion. Scorpio and Orion encounter each other, and they have an epic battle. You may have heard of man versus nature as a basic story theme. Well, this is God versus nature. Man, sit right down and eat your popcorn. They battled each other hard, but in the end, Scorpio was victorious and ended up stinging Orion to death with his poison tail. Orion was finally defeated, and all of Gaia's animals were safe, from him at least. Artemis is still out there hunting. Gaia did feel bad about ending one of her grandchildren's lives, so she immortalized Orion in the sky as a constellation. Are you wondering how Scorpio got into the sky too? Don't worry, we're about to discuss that with the next version of the story. Because yes, there are 4 alternate versions to this story, each one that builds on the last. It's like people just kept adding to what the last guy wrote. In the final version of the Greek stories, after the defeat of Orion, another god comes onto the scene, Asclepius, the god of healing and son of Apollo. Asclepius killed Scorpio, probably when he was asleep, because I don't know how a healer's gonna get that kill, and he ground up the scorpion's body into a powder. Asclepius then combined the powder with venom and a herbal remedy. He gave the mixture to Orion, and it brought Orion back to life, making him one of the first people in Greek mythology to do so. When Orion was brought back to life, this set off some alarm bells in the underworld, and Hades was outraged. He went to Zeus immediately and demanded that Asclepius be smited for breaking one of the laws of nature by stealing souls from the underworld. Not wanting to anger his brother, Zeus smited both Asclepius and Orion, turning them into constellations along with Scorpio. Orion was put on the opposite end of the sky from Scorpio, and Asclepius was put between them to make sure the two would never fight again. Asclepius would also be renamed Ophiuchus, the Serpent Bearer, and he's sometimes viewed as the unofficial 13th constellation. Yes, you heard me right, 13th constellation of the Zodiac. Despite what your star chart might say, Ophiuchus should be on the Zodiac, and the only reason he isn't is because people don't like the number 13. But the 13th Zodiac is a story for another time. Okay, so that's Orion and Scorpio in ancient Greece and Babylon. It's incredible to think how ancient these characters are. Over the course of roughly 4,000 years, from 2000 BC to the modern era, people have been telling and retelling these stories about how the stars in the night sky move. And obviously, it's not just limited to the ancient Mediterranean either. It's now time for a lightning round of Orion and Scorpio and other cultures around the world. In Egypt, Orion was viewed as Osiris, traveling across the night sky. Scorpio was still a scorpion, but he probably had some connection to the scorpion goddess Serket, rather than being just a random scorpion. In North America, the Anishinaabe called Orion the Winter Maker, or the one who brings winter. To the Anishinaabe, what we see as Scorpio, they see as Nanaboju, and I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that. They are hero god and one of the central figures of their religion/culture. And finally, in Polynesia, Scorpio is viewed as the hook of the demigod Maui, a central hero god in many of the Polynesian islands. In their religion, Maui pulled the islands out of the sea using his fishhook, which has been immortalized in the sky as a constellation. Orion also has an equivalent in Polynesia, but it's difficult to translate. The closest thing would be string art, but it's kind of like a cat's cradle if you know what that is. They saw Orion as a giant string art in the sky, making the shape of a canoe with 3 people on it. As you can see, people all over the world have incredible stories and beliefs about the stars in the sky. The constellations carry with them some of our oldest stories, and they're a fun way to see how people can think of different things when looking at the same set of dots. I want to thank everyone for watching this far into the video. I hope you all enjoyed, and if you did, consider subscribing if you want to see more. I have a Discord where I share memes and updates on future videos, and I also have several methods of supporting me which you can find below. So until next time, have a good one.